Luther Hayes had just pulled the nameplate off the locker he had used for nearly 30 years when the phone in the operations room began to ring. Marissa Keene was still standing beside the desk, the mandatory retirement folder open in front of her, the ink on the signature line barely dry. 6 o'clock this evening, she told him. Caldwell had to prove it could run without depending on one man's memory. Luther looked past her, through the glass, toward the tank cars waiting out on South Ladder, and he did not argue. He only asked whether the system called Railflow understood why Train 618 had not been cleared into Track 9 after 2:20. Marissa had no answer ready before the phone rang again. The first call was for him, so was the second. By the third call, nobody left in that room was looking at him like a man on his way out the door anymore. Those 3 calls would end up drawing a hard line between a man the company had decided was finished and a man who was still holding something Great Midland Freight had never gotten around to learning for itself. The story pulled back to that same morning, hours earlier, when the yard was still dark and the idling engines were the only sound moving between the rows of track. It was 4:58, and Caldwell Freight Yard had not yet woken up. Luther arrived early, as he always did, though nobody had asked him to. He had learned decades ago that the quiet hour before the yard hit its morning rush was the only time small things showed themselves clearly before the noise of the day buried them. He did not walk straight into the office. He crossed a stretch of platform, checked the lineup board, and stopped near South Ladder, where a single switch took a few extra seconds to confirm its signal. It was nothing that would trip an alarm. It was nothing anyone else would have written down. Luther wrote it down anyway. A few minutes later, he noticed a string of empty gondola cars had been staged ahead of a shipment belonging to Porter Harvest Foods. On the screen, the choice looked reasonable, since those gondolas had been sitting in the yard the longest, and the system was built to clear old inventory first. Luther turned to Jonah Reed, the young dispatcher on shift, and asked him a simple question. Did he know the exact hour Porter's shipment had to reach the eastern terminal? Jonah gave an answer that was close but not exact. Luther did not correct him. Instead, he told Jonah to pull up the actual customer commitment on file, and together they found a cutoff clause buried in the contract language. If Porter crossed that cutoff by even a narrow margin, the whole shipment would be bumped to the next available slot, and that single delay would ripple through refrigerated warehouses spread across 3 states. In that first quiet exchange, the pattern of the whole day was already set. Luther was not handing Jonah answers. He was teaching him where answers came from. Marissa arrived not long after, flanked by Dana Whitaker and Avery Collins, and this was meant to be the final day of the Railflow rollout at Caldwell. The new system had already done real good for the yard. It had cut the number of trains held for no clear reason, reduced the hours locomotives sat idle burning fuel doing nothing, gathered scattered operational data onto a single screen, and flagged conflicts that used to take a person hours of manual checking to catch. Luther had never fought the software. Jonah would say later that it was Luther himself who insisted the younger staff learn to trust it. The trouble was not the technology. The trouble was that Railflow still did not know every exception that lived quietly around Caldwell, the kind of knowledge that never made it into a database because it had never needed to before. Marissa had already read the transition report, and one line kept repeating itself under the heading of operational dependency, over and over in different sections, attached to different processes. Ask Luther Hayes. To her, that phrase was not a compliment. It was a warning flag on a company moving billions of dollars in freight. A business could not let 3 decades of institutional knowledge at a single terminal exist only inside one person's head, however sharp that head happened to be. She had already approved eliminating the position of Senior Yard Operations Coordinator, the title Luther had carried for years, and she offered him 2 paths forward: a training role at headquarters, hundreds of miles from Caldwell, or a retirement package effective immediately. At 74 years old, Luther chose to retire, and it was not because he wanted to leave the work behind. He understood, without needing it spelled out, that a desk job at headquarters had been designed for someone else's life, not his. In the morning meeting, Zarissa laid out her reasoning without cruelty and without ever suggesting Luther was simply too old for the job. What she said instead was plain and, in its own way, respectful. It was not that his experience lacked value, it was precisely because it held so much value that the company could not let it keep living inside a single person. Luther asked her a fair question in return. Where, then, had the company moved that knowledge to? Marissa looked toward Avery, who explained that most of the operational rules had already been captured inside Railflow. Luther did not push back on that claim. He simply asked how much of it counted as most. Nobody in the room could give him an exact number. Luther let the silence answer for them, turned back to his work, and before he left the room, he handed Jonah 3 short notes scrawled on a torn sheet. 618, 220, Porter, 447, Bishop, East Pocket. Jonah looked at the notes and had no idea yet what any of them meant. Luther could not have known, standing there with an empty locker and a folded retirement letter in his coat pocket, that within a few hours all 3 of those notes would collide at once. And that, for the first time, in longer than he could remember, the decision about what to do next would no longer be his to make. There was a particular rhythm to the way Luther moved through a yard that nobody had ever formally taught him. A rhythm built out of thousands of ordinary mornings, stacked one on top of another, until they became instinct. He did not look at Caldwell as a collection of tracks, switches, and cars sitting in isolation from one another. He looked at it the way a person might look at a living organism, something with a pulse, something that could run a slight fever hours before anyone else noticed the symptoms. A switch that answered a half-second slow was not a broken switch. It was a switch telling him it might become one later that afternoon, once the temperature rose or the traffic thickened. A gondola staged in the wrong order was not a mistake by itself. It was a small signal, pointing toward a much larger collision of interests further down the line, one that would not show itself until it was too expensive to fix quietly. 50 years had taught him that the difference between a manageable day and a chaotic one usually came down to who noticed the small signal first, and whether that person understood what it meant. The afternoon came quickly. Luther cleaned out his locker without ceremony because he had made it clear he did not want a farewell party, and the yard respected that. A handful of coworkers stopped by to shake his hand. Russell Grant, who ran track maintenance and had known Luther longer than almost anyone left on staff, handed him a cup of coffee without a word. Jonah asked if he thought the new system would actually hold up on its own. Luther told him it would, as long as the data behind it stayed good. Jonah pressed further and asked what happened if the data was not good. Luther said that was when the person running things had to know which questions to ask. Marissa arrived to finish the paperwork and told him, almost gently, that Caldwell needed to prove the organization was stronger than any single person inside it. Luther told her that was exactly what he wanted too, and the answer caught her off guard, because she had expected resistance, not agreement. The first call came from Elaine Porter, logistics director at Porter Harvest Foods, and she went straight to Dana without waiting for pleasantries. Her opening question was simple: was Luther still there? Dana told her this was his last day. Elaine's next question landed harder. Who, exactly, was going to handle Thursday's interchange? Marissa stepped into the call herself. Elaine was not attacking the new system on principle. She had a practical, specific concern. Her train was running longer than usual that week, and if it reached the terminal after cutoff, the entire block of freight would be pushed to a later window. Marissa assured her that Railflow had already accounted for the timing. Elaine asked a pointed follow-up. Was the system using a cutoff of 4:47, or was it using 5 o'clock? Avery pulled the data and found the software was running on the 5 o'clock figure. Luther stood in the background and said nothing, while Avery discovered that the customer master file had never been updated with a recent change, a gap of 13 minutes that sounded trivial but, in rail logistics, was exactly the kind of margin that could cost an entire slot. The second call came from Graham Bishop at Bishop Automotive Components, who had heard through the network desk that Luther was leaving. His question was direct: who would be handling exception calls going forward? Marissa told him a centralized customer desk would take over that role. Graham did not object to the idea itself. His only concern was whether the people staffing that desk would know which deadlines could actually be negotiated and which could not. When Marissa asked him to explain the distinction, Graham laid it out plainly. Some deadlines looked rigid on paper, but with enough warning, he could rearrange his own plant's production sequence to absorb the delay, while other shipments looked perfectly routine. Yet a single hour of lateness could force an entire overnight shift to change its plan. Luther had always understood that difference, because he never waited for a small problem to grow into a crisis before picking up the phone. Graham did not go out of his way to praise him. He simply said that Luther had never once called him without already knowing what he wanted to propose. The third call was the sharpest. Natalie Mercer, transportation director at Mercer Industrial Chemicals, asked directly which track Train 618 was being routed into. Railflow's answer was Track 9. Natalie went quiet for a moment before asking when South Ladder was scheduled to close. Avery answered 3 o'clock. Luther looked at her and told her to check the maintenance revision log instead of trusting the scheduled time. When Avery pulled the updated file, the real closure time was 2:20, a full 40 minutes earlier than the system believed, because a maintenance crew had pulled their work window forward, and the change had never synced into scheduling. If Train 618 entered Track 9 while South Ladder was already occupied, the tank cars behind it could be held far longer than planned. There was no immediate danger in that delay, but Mercer operated under strict internal limits on how long tank cars were permitted to sit in certain yard conditions. Natalie said plainly that if they knew South Ladder had shifted, they needed to reroute the train before it ever entered the yard, and this was the exact line Luther had scrawled on his torn sheet hours earlier. 6:18, 2:20. There was something almost uncomfortable about watching 3 separate clients, in the span of one afternoon, all reach for the same name before reaching for the company that actually held their contracts. It would have been easy for Marissa to read that pattern as evidence that Great Midland Freight had built its reputation on a single person instead of on a durable institution. And for a brief moment, she did feel a flicker of that fear, the sense that the whole operation might be standing on ground far thinner than any balance sheet had ever suggested. But the fear did not last, because underneath it, she could already see the outline of something more useful than blame. 3 demanding, sophisticated clients did not chase reassurance from a retiring yard coordinator out of nostalgia. They chased it because he had spent years proving, call after call, that when he told them something was fine, it actually was fine. And when he told them something needed attention, it needed attention immediately and without argument. Marissa began to understand something in that moment that the transition report had never quite captured. These 3 clients were not calling because they were personally fond of Luther Hayes. They were calling because he had quietly become the connective tissue linking customer commitments, maintenance schedules, dispatch decisions, and plain human judgment into something that functioned as a whole. Even so, she did not reverse her decision on the spot. What she said instead was that this was precisely why the system could not keep depending on one man forever. Luther agreed with her without hesitation. She waited for him to push back, and when he did not, he added one more line, quiet and unhurried. If you tear down the bridge before the other one is finished, the river is still there waiting underneath it. Just as Luther prepared to walk out of the yard for the last time, Avery noticed a fresh change on her screen. Railflow had automatically reordered 3 trains based purely on dwell time, and an empty consist had been bumped ahead of Porter's shipment in the queue. Luther studied the screen for only a few seconds before saying, simply, not to let that consist run ahead of Porter. When Marissa asked why, he told her that if she let it happen, there would be no room left to reroute Mercer's train later that night. She wanted a fuller explanation. Luther glanced down at the badge he had already surrendered, said it was no longer his decision to make, and walked out through the gate without looking back. Less than 20 minutes after Luther left, the plan Marissa had trusted Railflow to manage on its own began quietly pushing all 3 of Great Midland's biggest clients toward the same bottleneck. And this time, Luther was nowhere in the building. Marissa made a deliberate choice not to call him back. It was a reasonable choice, because if every exception at Caldwell ended with a phone call to Luther Hayes, the yard would never actually break its dependence on him. Jonah, Avery, Dana, and Russell were left to handle the unfolding situation on their own, and this part of the story needed to show clearly that they were not incompetent. Jonah quickly recognized that Porter had to take priority. Avery corrected the cutoff data. Russell updated the maintenance window in the system. Dana notified network control of the change in sequence. Together they rearranged the order of movement, and for a while, everything actually worked. Marissa herself spotted something Luther had never even mentioned that morning. Porter's contract included a partial block delivery buffer, meaning that if they separated out the most critical portion of the shipment, they could protect it even if the rest of the train ran late. Avery verified the clause, confirmed Marissa was right, and Jonah put the plan into motion immediately. It was an important beat in the story, because it proved Marissa was genuinely capable in her own right. Luther was not the only person in that yard who could see a solution, but solving Porter's problem created pressure elsewhere. Pulling Porter forward meant the locomotive Bishop's shipment needed was held back longer than expected, and Bishop's freight began losing time it could not easily recover. Dana called Graham directly. Graham told her he could still shift his plant's production schedule, but only if he had a precise, trustworthy estimated arrival time. The system produced a number, but Jonah did not fully trust it, since conditions at South Ladder were still shifting underneath them. Avery admitted the model was running on a standard assumption that no longer matched reality, and nobody in the room was confident about how much to adjust it. Meanwhile, Russell reported that a switch near South Ladder was showing signs of a delayed response, nothing that pointed to an immediate safety failure, but enough that if the switch had to be pulled from service unexpectedly, the yard's total switching capacity would shrink right in the middle of the afternoon rush. Marissa looked at the board and realized, almost at once, that Porter, Bishop, and Mercer were all converging toward the very same narrow window of time. Luther, meanwhile, had gone to sit in a diner near the yard, chosen a table by the window, and set his retirement bag down beside him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no radio clipped to his belt, and no one calling out his name over the airwaves. When Jonah tried calling, Luther looked at the screen and let it ring. It was not anger that kept him from answering. He understood that if Jonah leaned on him every time the yard grew tense, the young man would never truly learn to carry the weight of responsibility himself. Jonah and Avery kept working the problem without him, and eventually found a workable arrangement. Porter could still make its slot, Bishop could be held briefly at East Pocket, and Mercer could be routed through North Lead. On paper, the plan looked sound, and Marissa gave her approval to move forward. For a short while, the operations room actually felt calm again. The kind of calm that comes from believing a hard problem has finally been solved cleanly. Dana refilled her coffee. Russell stepped outside to check a physical signal box in person, rather than trusting the readout alone, a habit Luther had passed to him years earlier that he had never bothered to break. Avery ran one more pass of the numbers simply out of thoroughness, not because she expected to find anything new. Jonah allowed himself, for the first time since the morning, to lean back in his chair and imagine that the rest of the shift might actually be uneventful. It was exactly the kind of quiet that experienced yard workers learned, eventually, never to fully trust, because a yard rarely settled all at once. It settled in layers, and the layer underneath the calm was usually the one still waiting to move. About 15 minutes later, Avery checked the current status of North Lead and found it marked available. Something about that still bothered Jonah. He remembered a line Luther had told him once, that there was a real difference between a track that was open and a track that was actually right for the job at hand. Jonah called Russell to double-check, and Russell confirmed that North Lead currently carried a temporary speed restriction for heavy consists, and Mercer's train 618 was exactly that, a heavy consist. Sending it through that route would stretch the trip far longer than anyone had planned, and it risked locking up the entire northern line behind it. Jonah realized, with a small jolt, that they had just traded one problem for a completely different one. He picked up the phone and called Luther a second time. This time Luther answered. Jonah did not ask him what to do. Instead, he asked a different question. What would Luther ask him first? Luther paused for a moment before responding, and then he asked which of the three trains truly could not afford to be late at all. Jonah, answered Porter. Luther asked which train could tolerate delay if the customer was warned early enough. Jonah, answered Bishop. Luther asked which train could not simply be shoved onto the wrong track just to save a few minutes. Jonah, answered Mercer. Then Luther asked the question that mattered most. So why was Jonah trying to rescue all three of them, using the exact same method? Jonah looked back at the board in front of him, and understanding finally settled in. Before Jonah could put a new plan into action, Russell called again with worse news. The switch near South Ladder had degraded further, and maintenance wanted it pulled from service earlier than planned. If Marissa agreed, Caldwell would lose nearly a quarter of its switching capacity at the exact peak of the afternoon. Russell laid out the recommendation to take the switch offline, not because there was an immediate risk of accident, but because its instability could cause a failure mid-movement, which would create a far larger delay than acting early would cause. Marissa asked if they could hold off for one more hour. Russell told her it might be fine. She asked what happened if it was not fine. He answered honestly, they would lose far more than that single hour. This was a genuine decision point, and Marissa chose to take the switch out of service early, a decision that made the rest of the afternoon harder to manage, but proved once again that she was not a careless or foolish leader. It cost her operationally, and she accepted that cost with clear eyes. While that decision was being made, Avery began quietly auditing Railflow's own foundations, and what she uncovered was uncomfortable. The maintenance database updated more slowly than live operations did. Certain customer exceptions lived inside the customer relationship software, but never fed into the scheduling engine. Temporary track restrictions were tracked in a separate internal bulletin that Railflow never touched. Some agreements between the company and its clients existed only as scattered email threads. A significant amount of operational knowledge was still passed along verbally during shift handoffs, the way it always had been, long before any software existed to capture it. Avery summarized it to Marissa in one clean sentence. Railflow was not broken. It was simply solving the exact problem it had been given, nothing more. When Marissa asked where the real problem lived, Avery told her plainly that the company had never fed the system all of its true constraints in the first place. Marissa called Luther, but this time she was not asking him to rescue the yard. Her question was different. How long had he known about these gaps? Luther told her it had been years. She was not satisfied with that answer and asked why he had never forced the company to fix it. Luther did not get defensive. He admitted he had filed reports over the years, but he also admitted something harder to say out loud. For a long time, whenever a problem surfaced, he had simply called the right person and solved it himself, on the spot. The day always worked out fine. The company, though, never actually learned anything from it. Marissa asked, almost quietly, whether that made him part of the very problem she was trying to fix. Luther answered with a single word, yes. It was a moment that pulled the conflict between them into something more mature, something without a clean villain on either side. Marissa asked him to come back for a few hours. Luther agreed, but only under conditions of his own choosing. Jonah would remain the one actually running dispatch. Avery would document the reasoning behind every decision made that day. Luther would not issue direct orders unless a genuine safety issue arose, and every exception made would be explained afterward for the record. Marissa accepted every term. Luther returned to the yard wearing a visitor badge, with no applause waiting for him, and nobody telling him they needed him back. He walked into the operations room, and Marissa told him they had 5 hours to stabilize the situation. Luther looked at the clock tied to Porter's shipment and told her no, that was not accurate. Porter, he said, actually had 1 hour and 19 minutes. Once that window closed, he told her, the other 5 hours she was counting on would not mean much at all. They worked through the priorities together. Porter needed to leave Caldwell first. Bishop needed to be held somewhere temporary. Mercer needed to avoid South Ladder entirely. The most workable option on the table was routing Bishop's shipment briefly through East Pocket for roughly 20 minutes. Jonah stopped cold when he heard that idea, because Bishop had once sent written instructions explicitly forbidding the use of East Pocket for any of his company's shipments. If they avoided East Pocket, Porter risked losing its slot entirely. If they used it, Great Midland risked breaking an explicit agreement with one of the 3 clients who were currently watching, with real attention, exactly how Marissa handled her very first day without Luther Hayes in the building. Luther explained the history behind Bishop's objection to East Pocket. 2 years earlier, one of Graham's shipments had been left sitting there for nearly 6 hours, and the cause had nothing to do with the physical condition of the track itself. It came down to a failed handoff between shifts, a moment where nobody took clear ownership of the problem, and Graham only discovered what had happened once his own plant had already begun running short on parts. After that, he demanded, East Pocket never be used for his freight again. Marissa's first instinct was to conclude they should simply drop that option from consideration. Luther corrected her gently. Graham had not banned the track itself, he told her. He had banned the experience of being forgotten. That distinction, Luther said, was the real difference between reading a contract clause and understanding the reason it existed in the first place. Jonah made the call to Graham himself, without Luther touching the phone at all. He laid out a specific plan. Bishop's shipment would sit at East Pocket for no more than 22 minutes. The locomotive would remain attached the entire time. Graham would receive a status update every 7 minutes, and if the delay somehow crossed 18 minutes, the shipment would be released with top priority. Jonah would personally take responsibility for the outcome. Graham asked whether Luther was the one standing behind this plan. Jonah glanced at Luther, who gave a small shake of his head, and Jonah answered honestly that this was his own plan, and that Mr. Hayes had simply helped him test his assumptions before he brought it forward. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Graham agreed. It was the first moment in the entire day where real trust visibly shifted from Luther onto Jonah's shoulders. There was a version of that phone call, easy to imagine, where Jonah leaned on Luther's name to close the deal, where he told Graham that the plan carried the weight of 50 years of trust behind it. It would have worked. Graham would very likely have said yes on the strength of that reputation alone. Jonah chose not to reach for it, not out of stubbornness, but because some part of him understood that borrowing Luther's credibility would only postpone the moment when he had to build his own. Luther noticed the choice, though he never said a word about it out loud that afternoon. He simply filed it away as the clearest sign, yet that the young man across from him was going to be fine long after the badge, and the visitor pass, and the 90-day advisory contract were nothing but old paperwork in a drawer. Graham added one more detail before ending the call, something that mattered more than any operational figure on the board. If the shipment ran too far behind, his plant would be forced to change the order of production for the overnight shift. Nobody would be hurt. There was no catastrophe waiting in the wings. But more than 100 workers would either have their shift stretched longer than expected or be called back earlier than planned the next morning. It was the first moment where the audience of this story could clearly feel that every symbol on that scheduling screen represented a real person's, somewhere down the line, someone with a family, a schedule, and a life outside of Caldwell's fences. Porter's shipment, meanwhile, was closing in on its cutoff. Marissa remembered the contractual buffer she had discovered earlier in the day and proposed splitting off the most critical portion of the shipment to protect it. Luther studied the plan and said simply that it could work. Jonah checked the required switching moves and confirmed that, done correctly, the plan would sharply reduce the risk of Porter losing its slot altogether. This particular idea belonged to Marissa, not to Luther, and he made a point of telling her so out loud, calling it a good catch in 3 plain words. It was a small comment, Almost nothing on paper, but it marked the moment the two of them began to genuinely respect each other's competence rather than simply tolerate each other's presence. Elaine Porter agreed to the plan, but she wanted a real estimated arrival time, not a polished number pulled from a dashboard meant to look reassuring. Avery ran the calculation. Jonah verified it directly with the receiving terminal. Luther offered one small piece of guidance. Do not ask them whether they can receive the shipment. Ask them until what hour they can receive it. That distinction opened up an extra 9 minutes of flexibility, since the partner terminal agreed to extend its window slightly if the block order was finalized before the train left Caldwell. It was a narrow opening, but it was enough. Porter's shipment was given priority and moved out. Mercer's situation remained the hardest of the three. Train 618 kept closing in on the yard, and Natalie insisted that Great Midland make a final decision before the train crossed into restricted territory. South Ladder was effectively unusable. North Lead was too slow for a heavy consist. There was a third possible route, a crossover near a service track, that Jonah discovered while scanning the system, technically valid according to rail flow, but currently blocked by a set of maintenance cars parked in the way. Moving those cars would require pulling a crew off another active task, and doing that would push a different consist into its own delay. For the first time all day, there was no option left on the table where nobody paid some kind of price. Marissa turned to Luther and asked him directly which train he would save if the decision were his. Luther did not answer her question. Instead, he turned to Jonah and told him plainly that he was the one running the yard now, and the choice belonged to him. Jonah faced 3 real paths forward, each with its own consequences. If Porter was delayed, the company would lose its interchange window, the freight would be pushed to a later slot, and refrigerated storage schedules at several receiving points across multiple states would have to be rearranged on short notice. If Bishop was delayed, the plant would be forced to alter its production sequence, the overnight shift would absorb the disruption, and the company would face real, measurable added cost. If Mercer's train was routed incorrectly, the tank cars would sit far longer than allowed, the receiving plant's intake window could close entirely, the whole shipment might be pushed into a completely different cycle, and every crew scheduled behind it would be tangled up in the delay. None of these outcomes resembled a dramatic disaster. But each one reached out and touched hundreds of people who would never see the yard themselves. Luther told the team to stop guessing and start calling. Jonah called Elaine directly. Avery called Graham. Dana spoke with Natalie. Russell updated the maintenance timing with fresh, verified information. Marissa reviewed the actual financial penalties tied to each customer's contract. Within 10 minutes, they had something they had not had before: real data instead of assumptions. Porter turned out to have almost no flexibility over the coming hour. Bishop could absorb roughly 20 additional minutes without serious damage. Mercer, surprisingly, could remain outside the yard for slightly over half an hour, but only if the network dispatcher agreed to hold that slot open for them. Jonah proposed a plan. Hold Mercer's train outside the yard for 32 minutes exactly, and use that window to push Porter out, release Bishop from East Pocket, clear the maintenance cars from the crossover, and open the third route. Marissa asked him what the biggest weakness in that plan was. Jonah admitted honestly that network control might simply refuse to hold the slot for them. Luther nodded and told him then to call them before he actually needed the favor, not after. That single instruction captured the entire philosophy Luther had built his career on. Real experience was never about reacting faster once something had already broken down. It was about creating options before circumstances forced a person to rely on them. The call to network control reached Trevor Caldwell, a dispatcher on the connecting line who had known Luther for many years. Their history did not buy Jonah an easy yes. Trevor told him the main line was already running dense that afternoon, and holding Mercer's train outside the yard would only complicate his own plan. Jonah laid out the full picture: how long the hold would last, exactly where it would sit, when it would be released, and which route it would take afterward. Trevor asked 3 pointed questions. Jonah answered the first two without trouble. The third one stopped him cold. What time, exactly, could they commit to releasing the train? Jonah hesitated. Luther wrote a number down on a scrap of paper and slid it toward him, but offered no explanation and gave no correction. Jonah checked it quickly against Avery's and Russell's figures, and he realized, on his own, that Luther's number had been deliberately optimistic, shaved a little too close for comfort. Jonah added 6 more minutes to it before reading the revised number aloud. Luther allowed himself a small smile. Trevor accepted the commitment. It was a quiet, deliberate choice on Luther's part, not a mistake, meant to prove that Jonah could catch even his own mentor when the numbers did not hold up. Porter's shipment made it out of the yard within its window. There was no applause waiting for anyone. Elaine sent a short email to Marissa afterward that never once mentioned Luther's name. It simply read that Jonah had handled the recovery well. Luther read that same email over Jonah's shoulder, and it was exactly the kind of praise he had hoped to see. Bishop's shipment cleared East Pocket in 20 minutes, right on schedule. Graham called Jonah directly and told him that next time he should call before he needed an exception, not after. It was the beginning of a new kind of trust, one built directly with Jonah rather than borrowed from Luther's reputation. Mercer's problem turned out to be the hardest of the three to close out completely. The maintenance cars were moved, and the third crossover was nearly ready to use, but a track circuit unexpectedly showed as occupied, even though the physical track was clear. There was no immediate danger in the false reading, but the signal system would not permit a normal movement through it. Waiting for a technician to clear it manually would cost Mercer more than an hour. Jonah looked toward Luther. Marissa asked him if he had ever handled this exact situation before. Luther said yes. She told him to go ahead and handle it. He told her no. Marissa's frown deepened, and Luther simply pointed toward the rulebook sitting on the desk between them. There was an established procedure for restricted movement of Special L's authority, but it required Jonah to complete every step correctly and in order. Dispatcher authorization, confirmation from maintenance, acknowledgement from the crew, a strict speed restriction, and a physical inspection of the track ahead of the movement. Luther was not using 50 years of experience to skip past the rules. He was using that experience to know exactly which rule applied, and to insist it be followed to the letter. It was the clearest, single expression of workplace mastery in the entire day. Jonah carried out each step in order. Avery verified every stage of the process. Russell confirmed the physical condition of the track. Marissa kept the rest of the team from crowding around the console while the movement took place. Train 618 crossed safely through the makeshift route. Nobody shouted or celebrated. There was only a long, collective breath released at once, quiet relief passing through the room. For the length of that slow, careful movement, nobody in the operations room spoke above a whisper. Jonah kept one hand resting near the radio the entire time, not because he expected trouble, but because Luther had once told him that the hand that is already in position is the hand that saves a minute nobody else notices was ever at risk. Avery watched her screen without blinking, cross-checking the crew's position against the restricted movement authority line by line, refusing to let a single step skip ahead of the one before it. Marissa stood near the window with her arms folded, saying nothing, resisting an instinct that would have been perfectly natural for a chief executive. The instinct to ask for a faster update, to demand reassurance, to fill the silence with a question that would have done nothing except distract the people actually doing the work. She had learned, somewhere in the last several hours, that leadership in a moment like this sometimes meant simply staying out of the way. Marissa turned to Luther afterward and asked whether he had known from the very beginning that this was how the day would end. He told her honestly that he had not. She asked, then, what exactly he had known. Luther looked out over the board one more time and told her that he had simply known not to close off choices he was not yet certain he would not need. The following morning, Marissa called an operational review, and it was clear from the start that she was not looking to assign blame to anyone in the room. What she genuinely wanted to understand was why a single ordinary retirement had exposed so many weak points across the whole operation at once. Avery walked the group through 4 separate layers of the problem. Maintenance data did not sync into the operating system in real time. Customer commitments lived in a completely different system from day-to-day operations. Temporary restrictions existed entirely outside Railflow's visibility. And the knowledge gained from handling exceptions was never captured in any structured, lasting way. Marissa asked how much information actually lived inside Luther's head alone. Avery answered honestly that it was a great deal. But she added something more important than that number. The real problem was never that Luther knew too much. The real problem was that the company had chosen, for years, to store too little of it anywhere else. Jonah asked, almost carefully, whether Luther had ever resented being the one everyone called, year after year, while the company itself never built the structures that might have relieved some of that weight from him. Luther considered the question longer than he considered most. He told Jonah that resentment had never quite been the right word for it. There had been tired nights, certainly, and missed dinners, and a private irritation now and then when a call came through at an hour that no reasonable person should have to answer. But underneath all of that had been something closer to pride, the quiet satisfaction of being the person a shipment could depend on when nothing else was certain. The trouble, he admitted, was that pride and a healthy business were not always pulling in the same direction, and it had taken a forced retirement, 3 separate phone calls, and 1 very long afternoon for him to see that clearly enough to say it out loud. Marissa asked to see the notebook Luther always carried, half expecting to find some hidden treasury of secret operational wisdom inside it. What she found instead was ordinary. Phone numbers, names of people responsible for specific accounts, dates when cutoff times had changed, short notes about particular tracks, questions that still needed verifying, past mistakes and the reasons behind them. A recurring reminder scrawled more than once, call before it becomes a problem. There was no secret formula hiding anywhere in its pages. Luther told her plainly that if this notebook were lost tomorrow, the yard should not stop functioning because of it. Marissa reminded him that, only the day before, it very nearly had. Luther did not shift the blame away from himself. That, he said, was on all of them, together, and he used the word we, not the word you. Dana pointed out something the group had not quite said aloud yet, which was that the crisis had never really been about any single train at all. Porter, Bishop, and Mercer were simply the 3 clients unlucky enough to collide with the exact same afternoon that Luther happened to walk out the gate. The same gaps had been sitting underneath Caldwell's operations for years, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to expose them all at once. Marissa admitted that if Luther had retired on a slower week, the same weaknesses would have surfaced eventually anyway, just more quietly, spread out over months, instead of concentrated into a single unbearable afternoon. In a strange way, she said, they had gotten lucky. The problem had shown itself clearly, all at once, instead of leaking out in small, deniable pieces that might never have forced anyone to make real changes. Luther admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he had once tried to write a full operations manual himself. He pulled out an old, thick binder from years earlier to show her. Many of its pages were already outdated, because the realities of running a railroad never stopped shifting under people's feet. He had eventually come to understand that experience could not simply be locked inside a single book and left to gather dust on a shelf. What the yard actually needed was a living system. Every exception logged as it happened, the reasoning behind it recorded honestly. The responsible decision-maker clearly identified, the underlying rule updated when it needed updating, every change from a customer fed directly into operations, and senior staff trained to pass down their reasoning rather than simply handing down conclusions. Avery asked him one more question, almost as an afterthought, about whether he had ever considered building something like the exception library on his own, years earlier, without waiting for a crisis to force the conversation. Luther told her the truth. He had thought about it more than once. But the work of running a yard day to day never left much room for the work of building the tools to run it better, and there had never been anyone standing over him, insisting that the second kind of work mattered as much as the first. Nobody had ever measured him on whether the knowledge in his head made it into anyone else's. They had only ever measured him on whether the trains ran. He had been very good at the thing they measured, and quietly weak at the thing they never asked him to do. Marissa asked him what he would change if he had the chance to do it all over again. Luther told her he would stop solving so many problems entirely on his own. It was a genuine moment of self-reflection. He explained that his own efficiency, over the years, had quietly convinced the company the underlying issue was already handled, when really he had only patched it for that one day. He fixed what was in front of him without ever guaranteeing that anyone else would know how to fix it the next time it appeared. Marissa admitted her own share of the fault as well. They had correctly identified the risk of relying too heavily on one key person, she said, but they had wrongly assumed the solution was simply to remove that person from the equation. Luther told her she had not been wrong about the underlying risk at all. She had only gotten the order of operations backward. Out of that conversation came the beginnings of something new. Avery proposed building what she called an operational exception library. Jonah suggested that every exception should be logged with a clear record. What happened, what data turned out to be wrong or missing, what decision was ultimately made, why it was made, what the consequences were, and which rule needed to be revised as a result. Russell proposed that maintenance updates should feed directly and automatically into Railflow going forward. Dana suggested building formal playbooks for each of the company's most important clients. Marissa added one more requirement of her own. Every senior operator at Caldwell needed at least 2 people actively shadowing their work, so that no single person would ever again be the only one who understood a critical process. Luther agreed with all of it, without hesitation. Marissa then offered him something unexpected. She asked if he would return as senior coordinator for a full year. Luther told her no. It was not a bargaining tactic disguised as refusal. Luther genuinely did not want to reclaim the chair the company had pushed him out of only a day earlier. And the decision he made next would show Marissa, once again, that she still did not fully understand the man standing in front of her. Marissa assumed his refusal came from wounded pride. Dana wondered whether he simply wanted better terms before agreeing. Luther explained himself plainly instead. He was 74 years old, and he genuinely wanted to rest. He had missed more dinners, more weekends, and more holidays than he cared to count, all in the name of keeping trains moving on schedule. What actually frustrated him was not the idea of retirement itself. It was the assumption that 50 years of accumulated knowledge could simply be transferred to someone else over the course of 2 days. What he wanted, he told her, was not for the company to need him for another year. What he wanted was for nobody to need to call him at all, 3 months from now. In the weeks that followed, Luther found himself doing something he had never really done in 51 years on the job, which was watching other people work instead of simply doing the work himself. It was harder than he expected. There were moments when Jonah reached for a wrong assumption, and every instinct in Luther's body wanted to correct him immediately, the way he had corrected hundreds of younger workers before. He learned, slowly and with some discomfort, to let a small mistake play out a little further than felt comfortable. Because a mistake caught early by someone else's hand rarely taught the person who almost made it anything lasting. A mistake caught by the person who almost made it, one step before it became real, tended to stay with them for years. Marissa arranged a meeting that brought together the operations committee, alongside all 3 major clients. Elaine, Graham, and Natalie all attended in person. What mattered most about that meeting was what did not happen. Nobody in the room asked for Luther to come back. Elaine told the group directly that Porter did not need another Luther Hayes. What they needed was a system that could reliably tell them which cutoff times were real and which were not. Graham said they had no interest in special treatment. What they wanted instead was to be called before a problem crossed the point where it could no longer be negotiated. Natalie put it most plainly of all. If whoever came next understood why Luther always asked questions before committing to a route, she did not care in the slightest how old that person happened to be. Marissa looked over at Luther in that moment, and for the first time, she understood the full shape of what made him valuable. It had never been about keeping clients loyal to him personally. He had built trust, the only way trust is ever really built. By never promising more than he could deliver, by surfacing problems early instead of hiding them, by never disguising a delay as something it was not, and by genuinely understanding the human consequences sitting behind every shipment on the board. Marissa admitted the truth openly, in front of everyone in the room. They had tried to reduce the company's dependence on a single person, she said, but they had removed that person before they had actually transferred what he knew. There was no dramatic public humiliation attached to the moment. Nobody applauded when she acknowledged the mistake. Luther simply nodded once, quietly, and let the moment pass, without making it larger than it needed to be. Out of that meeting came a final agreement. Luther accepted a 90-day advisory role, working 3 days a week. He would not run the yard directly, and he would carry no authority to override Jonah's decisions. He would not become an informal hotline for every delay that popped up along the way. His job, instead, was to transfer his operational knowledge, help build realistic training scenarios, review the growing exception library, help senior staff learn how to properly mentor newer employees, and help Avery shape Railflow into something that reflected the real, messy conditions of the yard rather than an idealized version of it. Marissa agreed to every condition. Luther added one final term of his own. The new program could not be named after him. When Marissa asked why, his answer was simple. He did not want it turned into a monument. He wanted it to be used. 3 months passed, and the calendar itself seemed to move differently once the 90-day arrangement had a clear end date attached to it. Everyone in the operations room understood, without needing to be told twice, that a countdown was quietly running underneath everything they did, and that the goal was never to make Luther indispensable again, but to make him unnecessary in the healthiest sense of that word. Caldwell did not transform into some flawless, frictionless operation. Delays still happened. Switches still failed from time to time. Shipments still occasionally shifted their timing. What had genuinely changed was how the people running the yard responded when those things happened. Rail flow itself had been meaningfully improved. Maintenance updates now fed directly into the system in real time. Temporary restrictions were clearly visible instead of hidden in a separate bulletin. Customer deadlines were properly categorized by how much flexibility they actually allowed. The exception history had become fully searchable, and dispatchers were now required to confirm the actual source of any constraint before authorizing a critical movement. Avery had not tried to turn Railflow into a digital replica of Luther Hayes. She had simply made it a genuinely better tool. Jonah, by this point, had personally resolved dozens of exceptions without anyone's help. One afternoon, Porter changed its cutoff time on short notice. Jonah did not call Luther. He called the terminal directly, verified the change himself, updated the system, informed the customer, and logged his full reasoning for the record. Luther stood quietly nearby the entire time and said nothing at all. A separate shipment belonging to Bishop ran into trouble out at East Pocket. Graham called the yard, but he did not ask for Luther. His question was simply whether Jonah was the one on duty that day. Luther heard the question from across the room. It did not sting him in the least. He simply smiled to himself. Natalie Mercer sent a short email a month later that read only, "Your new process is working." She never mentioned Luther's name anywhere in it. In its own quiet way, that was the clearest possible proof that his legacy had finally outgrown the man himself. On the 90th day, Luther came back to Caldwell one final time. There was no crisis waiting for him. No frantic string of 3 phone calls. Nobody came running after him across the yard. Marissa met him near the gate and handed him a small box. Inside sat his old badge, its corner cut off according to standard procedure, along with a small plaque that read simply, "Luther Hayes, 51 years of rail service." There was no inscription calling him the man who saved Caldwell. There was nothing declaring him irreplaceable. Luther preferred it exactly that way. Marissa told him that on the day she first announced Caldwell had to prove it could function without depending on his memory, She had genuinely believed she was right. Luther smiled faintly and told her she had been right. Marissa studied him for a moment and admitted that what she had not understood, back then, was everything it would actually take to turn that belief into something true. Somewhere inside the yard, the radio crackled to life. A fresh problem had surfaced, an inbound train arriving earlier than scheduled. Jonah listened to the call come in. Avery checked the current state of rail flow. Russell confirmed the condition of the track. Not one of them turned to look toward Luther. They simply began solving the problem together. Luther walked out through the gate one last time. 51 years earlier, he had entered the railroad industry in a time when almost everything ran on paper, radio calls, and human memory alone. On the day he finally left it behind, screens, data, and software had reshaped nearly every part of the job. But one truth had never changed in all that time. A genuinely skilled person is never measured by how many people need to call them when something breaks down. They are measured by whether the people they leave behind know exactly what to do once they are gone. Inside the operations room, Jonah opened a fresh exception report on his screen. At the very bottom of the form sat a new field, recently added to the system. What assumption did you verify? He typed his answer and saved the record, the same way he had done dozens of times over the past 3 months, the habit no longer feeling like a task assigned to him, but simply like the way the work was done. Avery watched the entry post to the growing exception library and thought, briefly, about how strange it was that the thing which had nearly broken Caldwell on Luther's last morning was now the very thing making it steadier than it had ever been before. Russell would sometimes catch himself out on the tracks, reaching for his radio to ask Luther a question before remembering there was no longer any need. He never quite lost the habit entirely, and he did not try very hard to. Some things, he figured, a person was allowed to keep out of respect rather than necessity. Dana kept a printed copy of the 3 original notes Luther had left for Jonah that first morning, 6:18 and 2:20, Porter and 4:47, Bishop and East Pocket, pinned to the inside of a supply cabinet where nobody but the senior staff ever looked. It was not sentimental, exactly. It was closer to a reminder of how much could hide inside numbers that looked ordinary on a screen, and how easily a whole afternoon could turn on a gap of 13 minutes nobody thought to check. Out past the gate, Luther heard a train whistle echo faintly through the late afternoon air. He did not turn back toward the sound. He did not need to anymore. Caldwell had not forgotten him, but something mattered even more than that. Caldwell had finally learned it no longer needed to hold on to him, just to hold on to everything he knew.